Hi guys, this is a follow-up video to the how to adjust the rocker arms in a non-adjustable system. Questions came up as to why you would need to do that. In the most part, if it's a running motor and everything is hunky-dory, you don't. Everything should work fine, they all should be nice and solid, and it just runs. The lifter itself does all the adjusting, that's why it's a non-adjustable setup, and you don't have to do anything. The problems come up is to either you're dealing with a motor you're trying to make run that's sat for a long time, or you've rebuilt it and you've kind of changed things, or you have a running motor that you decide to put a cam and lifters into. So then things start to change. Now, in the case of this motor, which is just something that sat for a lot of years, I fired it up, I ran it, I put hours and hours on it, and I still had a little bit of rocker noise. The reason for the rocker noise is when it sat, the springs pushed down, and so this plunger, for years and years and decades, sat further down in the lifter. This plunger moves up and down inside the lifter in order to do the adjustment. Because it sat down, a bunch of crud and stuff built up around the lip up here near the clip. So the plunger couldn't come all the way back up in order to adjust the valve out. Now I could have taken the lifter apart, cleaned all the parts, tried to get it apart, they're pretty precision, and see if I couldn't free it up. And I've done that before in some motors. But in this motor I chose to just go to a little longer push rod on those that wouldn't adjust out. The ones that were loose, you know, you can see how all these are nice and snug. The ones that were loose, I added a little bit of push rod length to. That just moves the plunger a little further down to where it can actually move back and forth and go back to adjust it. Now inside the lifter you have, not quite, but almost 200 thousandths worth of adjustment. And normally you just push this plunger down like 30, 40 thousandths is all. And people ask, well, why don't you all go all the way down so it has more adjustment? Well, it adjusts both ways. One of the things you have to remember is as the motor heats up, things grow. When the push rod gets longer, you know, everything just starts getting bigger. You could add another 15, 20 thousandths with heat of preload into the lifter. So if you're at 40, you could be at 60. That puts you a lot closer to the center of travel. Now, the question came up is, well, can't you just run a longer push rod everywhere? And the answer is yes. I mean, Larry Kruzak of CMD years ago used to sell a 30 thousandths long push rod, and especially if you were doing a cam and you were messing around, he recommended you just throw a whole set of a slightly longer push rod in just to make sure. And that puts you a little closer to the center of travel on the lifter. So that helps eliminate you from having too many problems. You don't want to be all the way at the bottom. So you don't want to go to a real long push rod, because if you're all the way at the bottom, when it gets hot, it could actually hold the valve open. You don't want that. So, you know, a little longer is fine. Now, especially like I said in the last video, if you're putting a camshaft in, that can change things because the base circle of the cam is going to be smaller, which means the lifter is going to sit just a little bit lower, and then the push rod winds up too short. That's why sometimes when you put in a cam and you just bolt everything back together, everything clatters. Well, that's because you lost your adjustment. That 30, 40 thousandths is basically gone. And so suddenly you need to go to a longer push rod in order to do that. If you go to a big cam, I mean, you may have to go to a 75 thousandths longer push rod. It all depends on what else you do. Now, the other thing, you know, that can happen, and you need to look, if you find one that's loose, you don't just throw a push rod in. I mean, you need to look and see why is it loose. I mean, in this case, I knew it was because it was sitting forever. But you need to look at the rocker arm. I mean, sometimes the tip up here wears down, sometimes the tip of the valve wears down, and all that can give you more lash that you need to take up. And if this is way wore down, you're not really wanting to put in a push rod, you're wanting to put in a rocker arm. Same at this end. I have seen where you get a burr on the end of the push rod, and that starts wearing in the cup. And I've actually seen it so bad that it wears right through, and you open up the motor, and the push rod's sticking through the rocker arm. That's pretty extreme, but it does happen. So, if that's all wore, or if the end of the push rod got all messed up, then yeah, you want to put in another push rod to fix it. You don't want to be just putting in a longer push rod. So you got to look at what's going on and why you've got a particular loose rocker. I was just trying to say in the other video that one of the main adjustments is the length of the push rod. You need to be aware of that because you can run across them. I mean, when the factory built them, if they wound up with one that clattered just a little bit, either at the dealership or even in the factory, they would put in one push rod that was just a smidge longer so that it was nice and quiet and ship it out the door. Now, if you're rebuilding a motor, a lot of times this problem doesn't show up at all because you've cut the deck, you've cut the head, and this whole assembly is moved down a little bit, and that makes up for the other cam that you just put in because you've taken 40 thousandths, 20 out of the block, 20 out of the head, so suddenly you're 40 thousandths further down. That's also why there is a little bit of extra play in a lifter, is just in case something else happens, the lifter is still good. It's got some adjustment down as well as up. So that's some of the reasoning to look at. The other thing to remember on these is that when you get the heads done, if say you redo the heads, there is a spec from the bottom of the spring up to the tip of the valve. And that spec is because this is a non-adjustable setup. If that tip of the valve is sitting a little bit too high or a little bit too low, that's going to throw all this off, and these rockers aren't going to work well. Even sometimes a longer push rod doesn't get the geometry right if you put the wrong valve in, and it's way off. So you need to make sure if you're doing heads that that spec is being met so that everything will bolt together. But that also can throw you off. I mean, if you're at the bottom of the spec on the valve tip and you haven't really done anything else, the heads didn't get milled, I mean, suddenly you could be at the point where, everything needs a little bit longer push rod. So I was just trying to explain how you adjust the system, not all the whys, because there's all sorts of things that go on. There's all sorts of parts that wear, and that's stuff you need to look at if you find a rattly rocker. Now, a lot of times to test a motor, I mean, I'll roll it by hand, you follow the firing order, and you go through and you see how loose the rocker are. I mean, this motor's been sitting 2 weeks, and these are all still nice and snug, and the lifters haven't pumped out. And that's another thing to consider, is what is the lifter? If you're getting rocker noise, it is either the bore worn to where the lifter can't hold the oil in it anymore, or did you go to a different type of lifter that might be a slight bleed down lifter? Some of these lifters are not designed to hold the pressure that well in there. At low RPM, they bleed off some. An extreme example of that would be a Rhodes lifter. They're meant to bleed a lot down, and you will get rocker noise if you run that kind of lifter. So the question is, what lifter is it? Now, these factory lifters, even at 50 years old, are obviously still pretty tight. I mean, this is a good motor. So I don't really have to worry about that. That's part of the reason I'm trying to keep the cam in it. So you got to think about what's going on. I mean, a rattly rocker is not just throw in a push rod and that fixes it. And I've seen guys even on Chevys, well, I'll just tighten it up. 2 weeks later, well, I'll just tighten it up some more. And they've come to find out what's really happening is it's wearing at the cam, and the lifter's basically just slowly getting shorter and shorter. So you got to look at what's going on, what you feel like maybe the problem is. I mean, even on these push rods that I replaced, I took the rocker arm off. I took a good look at the rocker arm. I popped the lifter out. I made sure the bottom of the lifter looked okay. I didn't just throw a push rod in. I looked at some stuff and made sure that everything was okay. So that was just a quick video as to why you might have to adjust a non-adjustable setup. And there's really a bunch of reasons. So just be thinking about it and what's going on, and remember that the main way you adjust is push rod, and that's how this system works. That's why a lot of guys like going to a different adjustable rocker arm so that they have a little bit of give in the system. But you can make these work, and you just have to think about how it works. So anyway, that was just a quick follow-up video, part 2 to adjusting valves, to try and answer a few questions. Hope that helped. If not, ask me some more questions and I might do a part 3. See you later. Bye.